The three major religions in the world all come down to one story about one guy. And this story may have had the most impact on Western civilization in all of human history. It comes down to one decision from one guy. And that's what we're talking about this week. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Sometimes it's a little thing. Hello all, I'm the Mad Pastor, and Christianity sucks. It's boring, it's irrelevant, it's out of date, but it doesn't have to be. Let me explain why. This week, we are talking about the call of Abram, who will later be named Abraham. You may have heard of him. He is the instigator, the starting place, the apex of the beginning of three major global religions. We're talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They all share this one guy, Abraham, in common. The very beginning of the Bible's narrative for Abram as he starts out. So, for those of you who don't want to hear me read the Bible, you can just use the things down below. And for those of you who are hardcore like me, let's read the Bible. This is from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, and they sound like this. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land of a place at Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. So let's first talk about the context. Abram is basically a brand new character. He's a descendant of Noah somehow, and he has a wife, Sarai, and they are 75 years old. He's 75 years old. She's a little younger, but they haven't had kids yet. And we know that they're wealthy because they have a bunch of people that serve underneath them. And they are living in Haran. They initially set out to go to Canaan, and then their family stopped and settled in Haran. And all of a sudden, this guy Abram gets this call, these words in his head, maybe. I don't think it's that literal. I think this is probably a retelling of a realistic story. Abram almost certainly existed, but the idea that God spoke directly to him and he literally heard words in his head, that's a little crazy. So let's assume that this is more of a metaphor, that he was hearing God in a metaphysical, spiritual kind of sense. And the calling is not what you would expect. A lot of hay has been made about this particular moment in Scripture because it has had global impacts on all of Western civilization. But really, the call is very, very basic. It's simple. It's, hey, take your stuff and go over there. You know that place you were going to go, Canaan? Go there. Go to a place that I'll show you. So in essence, what we have here is an old guy with no kids, an old wife. He's got a nephew. He's wealthy, so I imagine him as being a bit bored. He's just looking at the horizon, wondering if anything will ever happen. And then he gets this harebrained idea, well, maybe something's over there. Maybe something's over there. And so he gathers all of his stuff, and he heads out, and he heads towards Canaan. Now, before we talk about the rest of the story, let's take a minute to talk about this idea of barrenness. The fact that Abram and Sarai don't have kids. It's not that they wouldn't want to have kids. It's not like modern day where you're planning your life and your career and we have birth control and we can actually take steps to plan when we do not want to have kids. This is an ancient Israelite Hebrew culture, and the idea that kids wouldn't be the product of a marriage is kind of unheard of. It is a curse. It's something that's gone wrong. So Abram and Sarai would actually feel guilty and shameful about the fact that they have not produced the next generation to carry on the name, to carry on what God has done through the ancestry of Noah. It would be a point of shame and something that they were disappointed about and felt sad about, not a point of choice where they're prioritizing something else over having kids. This would have been a bad thing for them, and they would have been embarrassed by it. So you can imagine Abram's shock if the calling was, I will make of you a great nation. You got to be imagining if you're 75 years old and your wife is postmenopausal, what do you mean you're going to make a great nation of me? Can't have kids. Can't pass on the lineage. How is that even possible? But you know what's crazier than hearing voices in your head? Doing what they say. And that's the remarkable thing about this story. There's this small call like, hey, why don't you go over there? And then Abram's like, okay, I'll take you up on that. And he does. He gathers all of his possessions, and he gathers his wife and his nephew and all the people who work for them, and goes on toward this land that God is going to show them. Now let's pause and talk a little bit about servitude. Particularly in the United States, we have a horrific history of absolutely oppressive and violent slavery. That's not necessarily what was happening in the ancient Israelite context. You got to understand, this story it's certainly much older than when it was written down, but when it was written down at around 600 BCE. So there were already all these Deuteronomical laws, all these numbers laws. There was a system of rules around the idea of servitude. And one of the rules was every 7 years, all debt gets wiped out and all the slaves get freed. So slavery wasn't the American style of slavery where we literally violently just took human beings and just absolutely forced them by brute violence into oppressive slavery, and we didn't care. They were just property. The Hebrew system of slavery at this point was very different. There were much more protections around the humanity of a person who was in servitude. So that's an emotionally charged issue and a politically charged issue for sure. And I'm not saying that having servants in this way was good, but you need to understand that the readers of this story would not have balked even a little bit at that idea. They wouldn't have batted an eye. That would have been completely normal, completely okay. And the humanity and the personhood of someone who was in servitude like that would not have been disrespected. And if it was, there would have been legal ramifications for someone who did that. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about the rest of the story. Abram takes all of his stuff, all of his folks, and he starts heading towards Canaan. And he enters into the land, and he comes to this place called Shechem, and specifically an oak tree, the oak of Moreh. And at this moment, according to the story, God says to him, I'm going to give this land to your offspring. Now, like I said, this story was written in 600 BCE, so the writer already knows how that's going to play out historically. So let's not read too much into the fortune telling here. The writer has the gift and the benefit of hindsight, knows exactly what's going to happen, but uses this as an opportunity to talk about Abram's faithfulness to this God that just started talking to him. See, the oak of Moreh and this place at Shechem, later in this very book, Genesis, is going to have significant impact on the descendants of Abraham. Jacob, who is one of those descendants, is going to make a pact with the people and with God, and they're going to denounce all the other idols in the land, and they're going to bury these idols underneath this oak tree. So before our character in the story, Abram, knows that any of this is going to happen, even though the writer definitely knows this is going to happen, our character Abram doesn't. This is what's called dramatic irony. The audience knows something that the characters in the story don't. And the writer is using this tool, dramatic irony, to lift up something that is pivotal and crucial to the character of Abram. Abram builds an altar to God before God follows through on the promise. And the writer is trying to lift up this idea that we should trust God and wait for God to deliver what God has promised. Now, why might that matter to his audience? Well, if you'll remember, the audience for Genesis is a group of Israelite people who have been conquered and deported. So they've been defeated utterly. They have been forced out of their home city, Jerusalem, where they commune with God, where God and people live in harmony. They've been forced out of that place and into a foreign land with foreign gods. So you can imagine that the message, wait for God to come through and celebrate and worship God before God comes through, might matter a lot to that audience in those particular circumstances. So to me, this story is ultimately about how following a small inkling of a calling can actually have global ramifications when we cooperate with what God is doing. When we make it not about ourselves, but instead about what God is capable of doing, the potential for small things to turn into humongous things increases. God is capable of making small things into big things. And so, before we get the benefits, before we see the results, before we get rewarded for our good behavior, let's follow the example of Abram. Let's practice being present in the moment now. Let's celebrate the reality of what's going on now, and let's build an altar here and now before we see everything come to fruition. Let's build an altar and celebrate and worship a God who has the potential to take small things and make them humongous. So, I've been the Mad Pastor, and I leave you with this blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.